Good afternoon and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you are joining us from. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to our webinar today. I hope that we all shall be inspired by the ideas and discussions around the opportunities and challenges for demand-driven research for evidence-based policy making and program development. Ladies and gentlemen, the Alliance for African Partnerships, USIU Africa, and the Network of Impact Evaluation Researchers in Africa thanks everyone for taking time to join this conversation that is aimed at ensuring a return on investment from our research effort, and this can only be achieved through utilization of the research findings. We have lined up stakeholders in the research ecosystem, ranging from funders, researchers, policymakers, program developers, media, and individuals who are affected by the development challenges that our researchers are seeking to address. We shall have opening remarks from our very own Professor Richard Mukadawire, a presentation of how the Network of Impact Evaluation Researchers in Africa describing how they are implementing the demand-driven research initiative. Thereafter, we shall have a panel discussion that have representation from the stakeholders that I earlier mentioned. We encourage everyone to post their questions on Q&A or chat so that we answer them as we progress. Towards the end, we'll have opportunity for quick comments or questions, and we request your consent to record this important discourse. I will now invite Professor Richard Mukadawire, the Africa Director for the Alliance for Africa Partnerships, to make his opening remarks. Welcome, Professor Mukadawire.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Amos Njuguna. We appreciate for your leadership in coordinating and moderating this important subject on looking at demand-driven research, or what others might call, research into use. So on behalf of the Alliance for African Partnership, and on behalf of all the institutions, the 10 institutions we work with, including Michigan State University as the 11th one, and the Regional Network of Agriculture Policy Research Institutes, would like to welcome you to this extremely critical subject that is at the core of current discussions at the African level as well as globally. I think you all of us are aware that both in Africa as well as globally, there's a call for urgency in translating research into use. There's an outcry there by politicians, our governments, by development partners, including communities, including some of us who work in the agriculture space, including smallholder farmers that are tired of research, pursuing research for its own sake. There's an outcry that research should not remain on the shelves of our offices or in laboratories, but it should impact on society. It should get out there. Maybe we might learn some lessons from the land grant institutions, which were created precisely to ensure that research is actually combined with outreach, extension, getting out to the communities. I think this is a very important subject that would resonate very well, and resonates very well with the African leaders who are calling for all of us to really move towards addressing impact on the ground. And in this regard, I would like to commend Professor Amos Njuguna from the United States International University Africa, and the other colleagues from the Alliance for African Partnership, and all other colleagues who have actually, availed themselves to be part of this dialogue. We, as the Alliance for African Partnerships, were committed to fostering the exchange of knowledge, among researchers, but beyond that, of course, in reaching out to our strategic decision makers to demonstrate that the research we are undertaking is actually relevant, but also to influence change and to influence reforms, because that's precisely why universities exist, particularly, in generating new thinking. We are here, in fact, in South Africa, engaging the SADC Secretariat to explore how think tanks can begin to input into the regional development priorities. And we're doing the same with the African Union Commission. How can we facilitate, researchers in contributing to the African agenda, more particularly the Africa, Agenda 2063? How can we influence that? And indeed, luckily, we've been requested to join the summit in preparing technical documents for the summit on soil health and fertilizer. But you can only do that, I think, if there's an intentional effort on the part of us as researchers in saying, the research we're doing is relevant. The research we're doing is going to support, in positioning Africa as a front runner in the transformation of the continent. We must make it intentional even at the country level in reaching out to our leaders and say, we're available to be part of shaping the kind of country we want, to shaping the kind of Africa we want. So I'm very delighted that we can get into this dialogue, and our listeners out there will definitely welcome your contributions to this debate. Beyond that, if there are any of the development partners participating with us here would like to reach out to you and say, we are ready to begin conversations on a different approach to research, not research for its own sake or leaving research in our shelves, but ensuring that this research begins to touch on lives, begins to be transformative in its approach. So we really look forward to this exciting dialogue, and would like again to thank our colleagues, Professor Amos Ngujuna and other colleagues who are committed to this work, and we trust that going forward, we will actually begin to look at some of the knowledge gaps and explore how best we might further engage our development partners, maybe to charting new research agendas, new methodologies, and new approaches in ensuring that we continue to make research into use, to make sure that it impacts on communities, it touches lives. With these few remarks, I'd like to pass on to our moderator, Professor Njuguna, to proceed with our dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mkadawire, for the insightful remarks and the reassurance that the Alliance for African Partnerships is on course in achieving its mandate and has made this as part of its strategy to ensure that we are doing meaningful research that is benefiting our stakeholders and the beneficiaries of research at the very, very least. I will now invite Dr. Sam Oti, who is the founding Secretary General of the Network of Impact Evaluation Researchers in Africa, to make the keynote speech. Dr. Sam Oti, please.
Thank you, Prof. I think I need to be made a co-host so I can share my screen. Alternatively, maybe someone can share the presentation on my behalf. I'll try to be brief. There it goes. Thank you very much, Justin. Yes, so hello, everyone. My name is Sam Oti. I am one of the co-founders of the Network of Impact Evaluation Researchers in Africa, and I'm currently serving as the Secretary General. My day job is as a senior program specialist with a Canadian funding agency, which is the International Development Research Center. My background is in public health and medicine. So, like I said, I'm one of the co-founders of NIERA. NIERA started several years ago, around 2017, 2018. And the history of NIERA is quite interesting in the sense that at the time, the likes of Prof. Amos and myself and a couple of other colleagues had gone through the East Fellowship, which is the East Africa Social Science Translation Fellowship at UC Berkeley with the Center for Effective Global Action. This is a 3 to 4 month fellowship program hosted at UC Berkeley under SIGA and really aimed at strengthening capacities of researchers from East Africa or based in East Africa on impact in impact evaluation research. So at the time we had completed that fellowship program, and we started to get the increasing amounts of requests to facilitate capacity building activities on impact evaluation or to provide technical support on impact evaluation. And so we spotted a gap that there appears to be a demand for impact evaluation, but it didn't seem like one, there was good awareness about the potential of impact evaluation, and neither was there at the time, in our opinion, a cohort or a critical mass of researchers who had the requisite skills in impact evaluation. And that essentially was how NIERA was born. And with generous seed funding from the Hewlett Foundation, we've grown into a network of dozens of researchers who have gone through the East Fellowship. And we now have a secretariat that is hosted at the United States International University here in Nairobi, where I am based. Prof. Amos is our chair. I'm the Secretary General. We have Dr. Christina File, who's based in Tanzania, who is our treasurer. And then we have a program manager, Jennifer, who is basically managing the network. Next slide. So I'd like to talk about our initiative, one of our flagship initiatives, which is the DDRI, a Demand-Driven Research Initiative. But first of all, just to give some anecdotal context in terms of what inspired the DDRI, or the kinds of scenarios that inspired DDRI. For those of you who are in Kenya, a couple of years ago, I think it was around 2013, when we just got a new administration in government, one of the things that the president at the time intended to do was to implement laptops, sorry, excuse me, tablet PCs in primary schools. And this was part of efforts aimed at digitizing learning. And it was quite a popular initiative, at least in my opinion. But after several years of trying to roll out that initiative, there remained question marks, as you can see from these two very, I would say, divergent headlines. On one hand, you have the government saying, that this initiative was an absolute success. On the other hand, you have the Union of Teachers, so KNUT is the Kenya National Union of Teachers, who was saying that it was basically a failure. And this was in 2021, right? So these are both relatively recent articles with very divergent views of the same initiative. Now, I'm not here to make a judgment call either way, but I think the point is we have many situations like this all across the African continent where policies are implemented, and it's hard to say, it's hard to say objectively in some instances whether these policy interventions have worked or have not. And I think this is where the issue of having integrating rigorous impact evaluation into some kind of, let's say, a pilot study of sorts, or even into the initial rollout of an initiative can help guide our senses in terms of whether such initiatives are worth the investments. Next slide. And so at the onset, when NIERA was born, we commissioned needs assessment to try to understand what was that opportunity, what was that specific niche. There was a lot of people talking about impact evaluation at different levels, right? But what was the specific niche that NIERA could fill in this particular space? And based on our needs assessment, we came to the conclusion that there was a strong demand for what has been framed as decision-focused evaluations. Next slide, and I'll explain a bit what that means for those who might not know. So decision-focused evaluations, and we like this paper, white paper published by our colleagues at 3IE, and they define decision-focused evaluations as a branch of impact evaluation studies that are demanded by implementers to inform decisions within the budgetary and operational constraints of whoever is going to be implementing that particular, let's say, policy or program. So the key word when we think, I'll say two keywords. That one, there needs to be demand for that kind of evaluation, and that demand needs to serve a specific purpose of informing a decision or informing a set of decisions, as opposed to, let's say, knowledge-focused evaluations, which are a bit more leaning towards the academic side and really about advancing our understanding or our knowledge about a specific thematic area. Next slide. So for NIERA, once our needs assessment gave us that very strong feedback, in the sense that we need to focus on decision-focused, no pun intended, decision-focused impact evaluations, that sort of became encoded into our mission and our vision. And really, our mission as NIERA is to advance decision-focused impact evaluations of development programs, and ultimately to improve lives and advance inclusive and sustainable development across this continent. Next slide. Thank you. Sorry, you might not be able to see this, but very briefly, this is more or less the theory of change that guides NIERA. And you can see that there are 4 pillars towards helping us advance our mission of scaling decision-focused evaluations across the continent, that we want to obviously generate evidence along these lines. We want to build capacity of other researchers and other stakeholders. We want to engage in policy outreach and communications, and obviously continue to grow as an organization, all towards advancing DFEs, or decision-focused evaluations, in the development space. Next slide. So with generous funding from the Hewlett Foundation, we have launched this initiative known as DDRI, which, like I said, is Demand-Driven Research Initiative. And the goal is really to advance the uptake of evidence-based research, and specifically decision-focused evaluations in development programming and policy decisions. Next slide. So what are the objectives of DDRI? So what we want to develop a set of decision-focused projects that respond to very clear and specific policy needs. We want to create awareness and understanding among key stakeholders about how important and how valuable DFEs are in informing development policies and programs. We want to be able to effectively communicate and disseminate the results of the DDRI projects, and ultimately to advance NIERA's credentials as a partner of choice when it comes to impact evaluation across the continent and globally. Next slide. So the approach to DDRI, I talked about developing projects, and we've done that through a competitive call for proposals, which was reviewed by external experts. We want to foster peer-to-peer learning among the cohorts of projects that we have built currently, and we hope to continue to build. Of course, because the decision makers are, at least in theory, meant to be part of the entire process. And I'll explain why I say in theory just a bit. Part of the process of co-creating these projects and co-creating the priorities, that there needs to be these roundtable and policy conversations so that there's greater ownership and uptake of what emerges from DDRI. And ultimately to reach across the divides and partner. And so if any of you is here who is interested in DFEs, who might be interested in DDRI, please, by all means, reach out to us. For us, it's an initiative that we hope will continue to grow beyond the current scope that we are able to support through the funding, the limited funding that we have. Next slide. So these are the 3 projects that we've sort of launched under DDRI. And don't worry if you don't really understand them. Some of them are Greek to me because my background is in public health, and this is out of my comfort zone. But you can see that we have, in a sense, quite sector agnostic. But again, the kind of projects that we have supported really reflect the diversity of expertise that we have among NIERA members. So you can see this, the first project is on gamified savings for gambling. The second is on what they call the parish development model, and using that as a method to reduce poverty among the urban poor in Uganda. And then we have a third project on HIV self-testing and improving that, and finding ways to improve that through a mixed method approach in Tanzania and Kenya. So you can see there's on one hand, we want to also work across countries, so not just in one country. And on the other hand, we work across different thematics. But again, like I said, DDRI is just, this is just the beginning, and our hope is to continue to grow the, should I say, cohort of projects that adopt this approach. And last slide, I believe. Next slide. Yeah, so some food for thought for the panelists in particular, and even for the audience. And the question that might be on your mind is, are these projects, the 3 projects, for example, that I have presented, are they truly demand driven? And these are really philosophical foods for thought, so to say. And maybe the question now begs is, whose demand really counts in the context of demand-driven research, in the context of decision-focused evaluations? Is it demand of the end user? So the way we envisage it is the demand of the end user, right? But who is the end user? Is it a policymaker? Is it some kind of practitioner? Should there be a weighting to whose demand matters? If there's a thematic that might not be demanded by policymakers, but let's say civil society demands it, should researchers like us give any attention to those that might not be aligned with what policymakers are demanding, but might be aligned with what others are saying? So again, these are just philosophical questions. But even in the sense that even when there is demand from the get-go, what is to say that at the point of when, because research takes time, right? And some of these projects, fortunately, they are short projects because they are small amounts. But who is to say that by the time you get your results, that the politicians and those that demanded the project wouldn't have moved on to the next shiny thing? I call this political attention deficit disorder, which can be quite common, right? We know the attention span of policymakers can be quite short because of so many competing priorities. So who is to say that when you get to that point that they wouldn't have moved on? Then is it still demand driven in that context? And then another question to ponder is, are the projects even rigorous enough? Like I said, they're small amounts, right? Thinking about $70,000, $80,000, right? Can they be rigorous enough in that context? Because we consider them pilot studies, right? And if not, our funders, and I'm looking at Chris and other colleagues here, our funders willing to pay more, right? Because of course, if you want a more expansive, more rigorous RCT, covering the whole country or covering several regions, you need to spend more money, right? So our funders willing to pay more for rigorous evaluations that for all intents and purposes, we don't know what the answer will be. So you could spend a couple of millions and it might show that those interventions are not worth it. And that's research. That's the nature of research. And like I said, so whose demand should we prioritize? Whose demand really counts? So on that note, I'll end and pass the mic back to Prof. Amos. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Samoti, for the presentation and posing some very important questions. And so to help us unpack the demand-driven approach to research, we have experts in the room representing funders, researchers, policymakers, program developers, and implementers. So we've got Chris, Elizabeth, Robin, Maureen, and Used Lad. So I will invite them to introduce themselves and react to the keynote presentation in a minute. I will not, we shall not use any specific order. So maybe, Chris, do you want to go first? And then we can pick everyone else. Just an introduction of who you are, and you can tell us what are your immediate reactions to this presentation.
Sure. Like Hewlett Foundation was mentioned a lot in Dr. Orti's presentation. And yeah, my name is Chris Iwana. I work with the Hewlett Foundation. We're a private foundation based in the US, and we fund evidence generation and evidence use for policy making. So NIERA, for instance, is one of our grantees. We also work with a lot of think tanks, universities, and others that are working within the evidence ecosystem to try and bring those tools that have been developed and refined in academia mostly to bear on decisions of policymakers. So I think a lot of what Dr. Orti mentioned is actually very relevant for the work that we do. And I think full disclosure, Dr. Orti cited the white paper that was published by 3IE. The four authors of that white paper were the founders of an organization called ID Insight. And so I worked for ID Insight for about 4 years as the head of Africa and as director for Southern Africa. So I very much believe, and I agree with what he said and what that white paper said, that we shouldn't just be doing research for the sake of, right? Like research has to have a purpose, and the purpose, especially in the context of very limited resources, and I think Professor Mkandori also alluded to this, within the context of really limited budgets, donor fatigue, we have to try and make research more decision relevant. And I'm using decision relevant and not policy relevant, because a lot of research is policy relevant, right? A lot of questions that researchers pursue touch on policy issues, but the research may just not be decision relevant in the sense that, one, there's not a specific use identified ex ante for that research. A user who has a question, who has a decision to make within a particular timeline, and then without having a user in mind, we sort of producing research and hoping that somebody will use it. I mean, it's that saying that if we build it, they will come. And so you invest a lot of time at the end of the research to try and disseminate. But that's just because there wasn't a specific user or a specific question that this research is trying to answer. Now, I'm oversimplifying things, obviously. But ideally, I think that's what, as a funder, that's the perspective that I come to this with, is how can we make these tools, the data, the research, the evidence, useful for decision making? Because ultimately, I think what we care about is improving outcomes for people in the countries where we work. So I totally agree with I think both speakers, Professor Mkandori, Dr. Orti, that we have to rethink how we do research and sort of embed a larger purpose, which is to try and improve decisions that ultimately improve lives. But yeah, I will have a lot more to say on this and other topics. So hand it back to Amos.
Thank you. Dr. Robin Miller, do you want to go next?
Sure, I'm happy to go next. So thank you for the presentation. I thought it was very interesting. I think I also was thinking a lot about the issues around what we're willing to invest in and support. I have lots of colleagues who always joke that you can tell the difference between evaluation and research by looking at what proportion of the budget goes to systematic inquiry. If it's research, 80%, 90% of the budget goes to the researchers and not to the interventionists. And if it's an evaluation, you might find that 5% of the budget goes to the evaluation activity. and the rest goes to the implementation of the intervention activity. I think investing in evaluation is critically important because that's where we see what happens when interventions that we think of in the hothouse of the university are actually implemented in daily practice. And that's where we have the most to learn about whether the kinds of ideas we have about how to solve social problems are actually sustainable and will have the consequences that we desire. And it's where we learn about undesirable consequences of what seem to be good ideas at the outset. So I mean, I think these are really important issues. I think it's also important to think about what kind of training and preparation people need to be able to do this kind of work, because I don't think it's the same kind of training that people ordinarily get when they're being prepared to be a researcher. So I think the talk raises lots of questions about how we prepare people to be able to do work that is in the field, highly applied, requires engaging with diversity of stakeholders, understanding what they value, what they need, how they think about solutions to social problems. It's a very different kind of training, and it requires a very different set of methodologies than the ones that most people who are classically trained are exposed to.
Thank you, Dr. Elizabeth Mpadawire. You can go next, please.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of such an important discussion. And I think Robin touched a little bit on this. So historically, researchers have really worked in isolation, forgetting that what they do has to have impact. It needs to be useful and usable by the world. Particularly if we think about the context of the multifaceted and interrelated challenges that we face today as embodied in the Sustainable Development Goals, it's becoming increasingly important for researchers to break out of those ivory towers, not only in the process of disseminating research findings, but through the entire research cycle. So as Robin mentioned, new ways of doing research are really important. Things like working across disciplines, understanding systems thinking, conducting responsible research, science communication, and importantly, what we're getting at today, collaborating with stakeholders throughout the research process. But this isn't the norm and requires new capacities to be developed. So I'm based at the University of Pretoria, and I'm the Network and Research Manager for a project called the Food Systems Research Network for Africa, or FSNet Africa, as we like to call it. And what we're trying to do is really challenge researchers to break out of this mold. We have 20 early career researchers, post-PhD, working in teams of 3 to 5. They include mentors from African institutions, as well as the UK. And each team has up to 5 disciplines represented. But importantly, fellows are also encouraged to engage with stakeholders from the inception of the research idea. So the point at which that seed is planted up until, well, all the way through implementation, through dissemination, up until uptake of findings into policy and practice. And we have a task team that regularly monitors fellows' stakeholder engagements to see if there's challenges, to ensure that fellows are genuinely engaging stakeholders. So yeah, I can talk a little bit more about that later on.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Maureen, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, and quite insightful conversations, and really glad to be here. I'll just circle back to what Elizabeth has rightfully mentioned, and Robin, and thank you, Dr. Oti, for the wonderful presentation. As we talk about evidence-based decision-making and research, indeed, I do agree that there is also a very important need for us to look at strategic partnerships so that we do not actually end up having research that is generated in isolation. And I will also maybe speak from Oxfam's perspective, where we are highly an evidence-based research organization because we don't do direct implementation in our projects. And as a co-function and element of that, with very minimal control, especially in project implementation, we are actually focusing more on evidence-based decision making, because our core work is on ending inequality and actually fighting poverty and ending inequality. And as we look at that, for instance, we've been able to leverage on some of those good practices, for example, on some projects that we have that are very new phenomenon, even for the country, as a country, especially around unpaid care and domestic work. It's actually quite encouraging that we do get some funding from, quite a lot of our funding from Global Affairs Canada and also Hewlett Foundation around generating research and generating evidence that influences key conversations that the country is only warming up to now, such as unpaid care and domestic work. And what we've realized from that process is that if we as researchers fail to have a co-design approach, especially that leverages on appreciating the different disciplines, the different actors, we are not able to really have that demand-driven research. So I do agree that it becomes extremely important in how we structure our research that we do leverage on working with various stakeholders. And for Oxfam, we do work a lot because, as I earlier mentioned, we don't do direct implementation. We work a lot with research partners. We do also have openings to work with universities, like we do have some level of working engagement with the KU Hub, University of Nairobi Hub. And this is essentially because where I work, in the unit that I work at Oxfam as gender justice work, is we have quite a lot of work on urban food hive systems, which are also very new conversations in terms of regenerative nourishing food systems in the urban settlements. So it becomes very important that our research is demand driven, because again, as was rightfully put by Chris, is that there's a lot of shrinking space in terms of funding for such disciplines and discourses. So coming together becomes very important. I'm sure we'll be able to share some few examples of how we can work best and how we can learn from each other. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much for that. Lastly, but not least, Dr. Just Dilat.
Thank you very much, Amos. Thank you very much, colleagues, for this opportunity to participate in this panel. My name is Joost de Laat. I'm a professor at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and active in what I try to do is a demand-driven evidence generation in a variety of ways. I'm an economist by background, and so I come to this panel as a researcher. I also come to this panel as somebody who's worked on the funding side of research, both at the World Bank, where I managed the Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund, and at a large foundation called Porticus. And it's from these two perspectives as research and within the funding world that I want to share some complement actually the things that have been shared already. So I think as a researcher, one of the things to maybe to highlight that I think is important is the incentives that researchers face. And so, you know, I see among many of my colleagues very much an interest to be demand driven and to have impact in the work that they do. I mean, that's the reason why many of us become researchers, because we see it as a means to contribute. But there are also kind of institutional structural incentives that stand in the way. Many of our institutions in the end, evaluate us on the basis of our publication records and not necessarily on the impact that our research is having. And so there are some movements there as part of the whole open science movement. Within Utrecht University, we're moving now to call a triple model, where also impact is one of the things that is an explicit part of how we as researchers are being evaluated. So universities should broaden their evaluations, but that's a long process. But there's some movement being made there. And that might require some trade-offs, for all of us engaged in this work, to work closely with stakeholders, and not just collect your data, run back home and write them up and publish. Takes time to make sure that the questions that you're trying to answer through your research are demand-driven, so to say. Takes time also before the research, and so all of these things need to be taken into account, thinking about the incentives that researchers face. Another element of that is around kind of who are the researchers. We just finished a project, a collaboration where Utrecht partnered, or actually NIERA partnered with Utrecht. NIERA was in the lead on a project to build capacity among educators within higher education institutions to teach impact evaluation methods to students. And that was an initiative from the idea that, hey, many of the evaluations that are done in the continent in Africa are done by researchers outside. And if a next generation of students is taught these methods in university, then you'll get a flow of researchers coming out of that. On the other end, you also get a flow of policymakers that are more attuned to the evidence. So kind of the capacity and the interest and desire to do this work within the countries where the research is being done, I think is also a very important element. And then the last small point to emphasize from the funding perspective, these things take time often. The research cycle takes time, the policy dialogue takes time, and where you start in the beginning is likely not where you expect it to end up. So it takes time and requires flexibility also from the funders to take more of a long-term perspective, to allow there to be changes made along the way and build that into your funding cycle. So researcher incentives and taking a long-term and flexible perspective from the funding cycle are two of the things that I would like to add. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Joost. And now it's good we've opened up the discussion with the panelists. So I will put up a question to Dr. Robin Miller. And I've been looking at your work and drawing from your extensive work on advancing the science of community-based interventions, your work on empowerment evaluation, as well as accomplishing structural change and student opportunities for AIDS HIV research. That's your SOA project. So drawing from your experiences, Dr. Miller, what insights would you share with us on training a new generation of scholars to undertake community-engaged and demand-driven research?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to speak to that. So right now, according to the International Organization for Cooperation and Evaluation, if you are an African scholar, there are only 12 countries that offer evaluation-specific training available to you. And many of the people who are teaching in those programs, certainly in terms of the programs that I've worked with, have not had the benefit of getting extensive training in some of the kinds of things that we're talking about. When I did needs assessment for the Dar es Salaam's program of the faculty and their preparation to be able to teach, the areas where they had limited exposure really had to do with these kinds of theories of practice that are about engagement, the kinds of skills that are required to help people facilitate a process. Because evaluation is a process, right? Of articulating what people value, resolving conflict, making decisions about the criteria of merit for the things to understand what we mean by the quality of an intervention or a program or a policy. All of those kinds of things were pieces of training that the faculty didn't have. Where they had tremendous amounts of training were in technical matters. And so I think part of what we need to be thinking about is helping people to get greater levels of exposure to the diversity of theories of practice that exist for engaged work, whether it's action research, community-based participatory research. There are lots of models, both within evaluation and outside of it, that will help you think about how to do this work, and that you can choose among based on the situation. So exposure there, and to some of the kinds of different standards of quality that inform evaluation work, because they exist and they are different. And also to understand some of the evaluation specific methodologies, because there are also evaluation specific methodologies that have been developed over time to solve the unique challenges that one faces in doing evaluation. So there are contribution analysis. There are models that are very, very specific to trying to understand causality in the context of complexity. So models that move us beyond just thinking about a traditional quasi-experiment or, experiment in the field. And there is a tremendous wealth of knowledge about facilitating evaluation, about communication, about data visualization, those kinds of other things that are really important if you're going to do work that's useful, relevant, timely, and also maintains, scientific accuracy. So, I think the Canadian experience is actually interesting. Canada is one of the few countries in the world that has a system of credentialing evaluators based on what are pretty globally agreed sets of competencies for evaluators. There are about 12 sets of competencies that exist in the world for what a skilled evaluator needs to know, understand, be able to do. They differ, obviously, based on the cultural context they grow out of, but they're more similar than they are different. And if you look at where people applying for credentialing tend to have strength and where they tend to have weakness, again, it really is having this unique theoretical perspective about practice that is appropriate to doing this kind of work. So I think that's really both growing the number of programs that are available in Africa, but also ensuring that they are well infused with theories of practice and techniques of practice that are specific to what we're talking about, both the ones that are being developed in Africa now as part of the Made in Africa movement, but also ones from other countries that are essentially reflections of years of what we've learned in trying to do this in different country contexts.
Wow, thank you very much. Rethinking new models, thinking through how to retrain some of us who have not had the benefit of having gone through experiential training, working with different stakeholders. I now want to draw to Dr. Elizabeth. Your work has really contributed to policy reforms in food security and nutrition in Malawi, and a very interesting initiative on the International Food Policy Research Institute Compact 2025 initiative. And my question to you, Dr. Elizabeth, would be, how practical was it for you as a researcher to engage in knowledge generation that contributed to such impressive work? And what were the challenges?
So I think part of the advantage that I had is that many of the communities I had worked with before, and I think that's critical to establish that relationship with people prior to even collecting your data and starting to do your analyses, making sure you do that. And I think importantly, so one thing I will point out is that a lot of the communities where we're doing research, they have researcher fatigue. They're tired of the work that we do being extractive and not going back to them. So one of the things that the communities that I worked with said to me was, well, you people, what are you're going to take our information, go out there, and you'll never bring it back to us. And I made it a point to make sure that not only did I bring the information back to them, but I ensured that they were part of the conversation around how do we reform the National Nutrition Policy and Strategic Plan that was being revised at the time. So I had the advantage that it was a window of opportunity in terms of influencing policy. And I think that is where the largest impact happened. But again, if I look at my example and how we apply it to the context of FSNet Africa, one of the critical things that we try to do is ensure that stakeholders are involved throughout the research process, because you start to build that relationship with people to ensure that your evidence is taken up into practice and policy. So, for example, when our fellows were first selected in 2021, in July, they were given a high-level overview of the training that they would receive. They participated in an orientation where they developed a stakeholder map. This map enabled them to identify stakeholders who had an interest and who could influence their research. And I think part of this is also about negotiating the trade-offs, because although we are trying to engage different stakeholders, we also need to appreciate that they have different interests that sometimes might be conflicting. So we also have to be able to manage that. Then in week 6, our fellows presented their research ideas, like I said, that first seed, to a stakeholder audience. They gave them feedback to say, is this relevant to us? Can it actually work? What more do we want to see coming out of this research? Again, in week 14, they presented more developed research ideas. And then fellows went back to delve deeper into the literature. And during this period, we provided them with training on concepts such as systems thinking, gender responsive research, responsible research as well. They then presented their fully developed proposals to a wide stakeholder audience that included experts as well. Again, they were given feedback to try and panel beat their research ideas. So throughout the process, we've aligned our training offering to different stages of the research implementation, but also we've tried to ensure that stakeholders are intimately involved in the process. And when I say stakeholders, it is farming communities, because our project focuses on food systems. It is policymakers, it's private sector, it's the decision makers that we continue to talk about. Many of our fellows now are currently implementing their research projects, some in consultation with stakeholders and some in collaboration with stakeholders. So I think nurturing that relationship with the communities that you work with is really important to ensure that the research outputs are taken up into evidence and practice.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that. And just picking on that, Maureen, now Elizabeth is more of a researcher, and Maureen, you are more of a program developer and implementer in the areas of gender inclusion, and you've done quite a bit of work on agricultural value chains, decent work and safety for women, minority, and migrant workers. So the question I would have for you, Maureen, is how have you used the evidence that is generated by the researchers to inform your work, and have you encountered any challenges in that process?
Thank you very much. So maybe what I could just speak to first is the process that we've always been following, especially from an implementation perspective. And it's mostly anchored around feminist participatory action research models. And as we talk about feminist perspective, our research mostly is usually anchored in methodologies that allow we call them beneficiaries. I'm sure maybe you've seen around Oxfam inclusive language terminologies where we talk about challenging traditional ways of conducting research. And as we do this, we are able to build relationships within the information gathering and research and evaluation processes. And how we've been able to see good results is because even through the whole systemic review process, we believe that our beneficiaries, whether the demand is from the policy actors, the demand is from our from our beneficiaries, we always hold firm to the virtues of ensuring that our audiences remained empowered agents through their active participation. So when we look at that, for example, as you've mentioned on our work on decent, on promoting or advancing decent work, I will maybe make reference to what we are currently channeling is, what we are currently working on is advancing ratification of ILO Convention C-189 and C-190 within the context of within Kenya, of course, having the understanding that that has not been ratified in the country. So Oxfam, as I'd earlier mentioned, we don't do exact direct implementation. So we do the convening part, and we've been able to bring together 16 different stakeholder organizations that are actually leading this process as we continue to work with the Kenya government, especially in uptake of some researches that we've done. One of the particular research that we've done is barriers to women's economic empowerment. And one of the greatest challenges that we have seen is the patterns of the labor, patterns revolving around labor, and also patterns around how women access financing, especially even for those in informal work and those in formal settings. So how we've been able to implement our research and findings has actually been through working with our partners, because our partners don't directly involve themselves in the broader aspect of the research part. But we do have policy dialogue sessions, we do convene round tables where we disseminate that particular research. And further to that, also, for example, we have been working on the Time Use survey. This month, we will be looking at convening different stakeholders for user dialogue forums, where different sectors are able to really evaluate, okay, having drafted the Time Use survey and having been in that process, how exactly will those, how exactly will that data be relevant for the different sectors that we have, that is water, health, and sanitation. Maybe what I would mention is that, of course, there's areas of learning where we, of course, have to look at a more succinct demand-driven data strategy. I feel that that becomes very, very important for us to have a demand-driven data strategy, especially as we look at different disciplines. For example, for Oxfam, our priorities are on ending violence. We have priorities on decent work. We have priorities on food systems. So the challenge has always been on how do we have a demand-driven data strategy that, of course, allows us to not have what we call a virtual shelf of research that we are not really using. So by and large is that we do have a lot of convening, and we also engage in a lot of influencing for impact, because Oxfam is highly an influencing organization. So by influencing for impact, we have guides that border around coalition, bordering on having collective voice, especially on influencing for impact with the research that has been generated. So we are moving with networks, we are working with coalitions so that we are able to have one voice, especially once we are able to have the research that is there. So I would maybe talk about influencing for impact that is driven by the research that we have and having collective voice around that. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen, for that articulate answer. And possibly I would now throw it to Chris. Chris, you've got this extensive experience working from the giving side. You offer financial and other support to researchers and other stakeholders, basically to enhance evidence generation and uptake of evidence. What would you say is the role of funders in promoting demand-driven research? Do funders have any role to play in promoting demand-driven research?
Yeah, I think funders have a big role to play in promoting demand-driven research. I think there's been a lot of talk recently around localization. So philanthropy funding comes with a lot of power, right? And we don't, like, I don't want to be the one setting the agenda. Ideally, I think, and I say ideally because it's not the case, ideally funders would cede power and control. Not all of them, but some would be willing to cede power and control in terms of supporting research. And I say ideally because money is not the only reason that most research is not demand driven. Ideally, you could write a check to a research institution or to a researcher, a university, and trust that they will go off and design and conduct research that's decision relevant. And I say that I'm using decision relevant because instead of policy relevant, because ultimately we want to inform decisions. But I think it's difficult to do that because that assumes that universities and researchers are benevolent, that they have good intentions and their incentive structures are appropriate for advancing evidence use or the relevance of the research that they conduct. But we know that that's not the case. I think the earlier speakers, Dr. Delat mentioned that the incentive structures in universities are not always set up to promote demand-driven or decision-relevant research, because there's that saying that you either publish or you perish. You, as a researcher, you get rewarded if your publications are cited. And oftentimes what's most publishable is not the most decision relevant. And I think universities get, rankings are improved if a lot of researchers get a lot of citations. Teaching is not rewarded the same way. And so I think there was a lot of discussion earlier around incentivizing teaching or building skills to teach these newer methods of doing research. But that's not rewarded the same way as research and publication is within our universities. And a lot of our universities are structured the same way as Northern or Western universities, where publication is the biggest incentive. And so given that researchers, and not all researchers, but several researchers and several universities are not set up to promote demand-driven research, I think the role that funders can play is to establish some guardrails around what research should be commissioned, what research should be done. And I think there are very few. One, Dr. Mkandawire, Richard mentioned sort of, I think, identifying and research themes or topics that need to be prioritized, that align with society needs, economic development goals, with policymaker priorities or public interest. I think we see a lot of researchers do that, sometimes too much, being too prescriptive. I think we want to give the people that are more proximate to the issues the agency to determine what research is important in any given context. And so I see the role of funders as setting sort of the higher level guardrail in terms of these are the areas that we think more evidence is needed, and then letting researchers collaboratively, if it's global north and global south, but ideally those that are closer to where the decisions need to be made to be the ones that actually define the questions and drive the research. So I think by placing specific guardrails around what types of research, in which areas, research by who, for who, with who, research by when, funders can direct researchers to focus on what's important for informing decisions. And I think a good example of this is the very foundation that I work for, the Hewlett Foundation. We have an entire funding strategy focused on informing the decisions of policymakers with evidence. That's a huge signaling effort. We don't fund organizations, think tanks, universities just for the sake of. We fund them so they can generate evidence for policymakers. And because we believe that there must be a higher purpose, as I mentioned, for research and evidence generation. And that higher purpose is for evidence to improve lives, the lives of people. So I think that's one way that funders can signal and help promote demand-driven research. I think the other way is sort of these collaborative research initiatives. I think sitting where I sit in sort of this privileged position of working for an organization that has resources that are made available to others to enable their work. We can facilitate collaborative research that bring together multiple stakeholders, including researchers, industry partners, policymakers, and others, and to encourage the co-creation of research agendas, ensuring that scientific investigations are driven by the needs and the perspectives of intended beneficiaries as well as intended users. I mean, I think this approach just helps to bridge the gap between research as well as practical applications. And I think the final thing that I'll mention is, I think as Dr. Ott mentioned in the keynote, that research takes time. And policy making is so dynamic, it moves so fast. I've sat in ministries where decisions need to be made within a few days. So I think we need to balance so that we need to balance rigor and the practicalities of policy making. Ideally, we want like very high external validity, very high internal validity for our research. But it's just hard to do that in some cases. And I think it's better in some instances to have some evidence than no evidence at all. And so I think being very practical is necessary. And I think this touches on the incentives piece, right? Like allowing researchers, restructuring the incentives within the universities in Africa so that researchers get rewarded for doing policy engagement, for informing the decisions of government. That's not acknowledged at all. And so nobody, a young postdoc, somebody fresh out of their PhD, who is very ambitious is going to prioritize the decisions of governments. They'll always prioritize academic progression, because when they go for their next interview, or when the Senate or whoever meets to consider who gets a promotion, they'll look at citations, who got the most citations and who published in the most high impact journal among this list of people that we're considering for promotion. I think it's only people, researchers that have earned the right, they're tenured, that eventually get the freedom to do whatever they want. And those that we see, I think within our funding, those are the people that are able to commission research that they don't care about publication, because they already have 100 different other articles in journals. And so at that point, like that's too late. Like we don't want for somebody to be 75 for them to start doing decision-focused research. Like we want the younger, the energetic researchers to be the ones that are running around and working with policymakers and decision makers to inform their decisions with research and evidence.
Thank you, Chris. And picking from there, the issue of the academic comes in together with the locally relevant research, and this is something I know you've been working on. And so my question to you, and you also talked about it, so I'm literally cycling back to you. So the question I would have for you is, how can faculty balance their scholarly careers and the need for locally relevant research? I know you've been a researcher, you've been in both worlds, and you have succeeded in it. How can faculty balance their interests?
That's a great question. But in some ways, I would say by following your heart and not always following the incentives that are laid out in front of you, and then hope for the best. I mean, there's part truth in that, and I also want to second Chris's comment that once you you're tenured and you've got publications behind you. It gives a certain amount of freedom to take more risks and to not worry so much about the publications. But in the meantime, I think there are so many young researchers who would have loved to be engaged in demand-driven research and be spending a lot more time, not just on the analysis and publication, but also on the policy dialogue around that, whether it's with government or civil society organizations. And so now I think I don't have a clear answer, but I think a number of elements that I think are important is one, to really think about the incentives that are there for researchers, and that's a responsibility that universities have. I do see some changes there, and that universities are increasingly recognizing that they have a social mission to contribute, and that means that they need to evaluate their staff differently. And so that those are on those sides of incentives. I also think there are some practical elements, like on the funding side, young researchers that need to buy up teaching time, that funders allow for that to be included in project proposals. But also I think part of it is through exposure, through webinars like these and other events, that it's actually incredibly fulfilling to be engaging in your research directly with key stakeholders, and that in alone is such a motivation to keep doing this work. I want to give one kind of example from, and I'll be very brief, from my own work, which is actually an example from Bulgaria in Eastern Europe, where a big policy question, not just in Bulgaria but Eastern Europe and Europe more generally, is that there's a large minority of Roma, of ethnic Roma in Europe, and that are living in, on average, in very poor living conditions, and have poverty rates that are above 80–90%. And so I've been involved in a randomized controlled trial that was funded partly through philanthropic funding, partly through government funding. This was the UK government to the World Bank. And we were working together with the government of Bulgaria, with a civil society organization that was willing to take a long-term perspective. And through this randomized controlled trial, we learned that a number of barriers, very practical barriers, stood in the way of parents sending their children to preschool. Now we're actually still working on the academic publication of this RCT, but already 2 years ago, the government of Bulgaria adopted a new law. It was passed by Parliament unanimously. In fact, I think it's the first time that there was a unanimous decision in Parliament to remove school fees for preschool, because that was the barrier that we identified through this RCT. And so seeing that as a researcher and that result now is for me such a motivation to keep doing this work. And so I think it's partly by incentives. I think it's partly by universities, by facilitation that funders can do, but also, organizing opportunities where researchers engage with policymakers and decision makers more broadly, and people are inspired by this. And I think particularly young researchers coming in are often with a desire to have impact. And so I think that element of being inspired and motivated to continue doing this is also powerful and not measurable.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for the answer. Now we've got quite a number of questions from the audience, and I believe we should be able to handle them in the remaining few minutes, because we want to end this in the next 12 or so minutes. There is a question there and directed to Dr. Oti, Samuel Oti, that you've done an articulate presentation, but you seem to focus too much on the implementers. And the member of the audience is asking, where does that leave the public and the society that eventually uses the results of the research? Dr. Oti, if you are there.
Yes, thank you very much. And it's a great question. And that's why when I talked about some of the philosophical food for thought, I talked about whose demand really matters. Is it the demand of the policymaker? Is it the demand of the community? And I think there's no magical answer to that other than it depends. It depends on the context. It depends on the specific questions that are under consideration. So I don't think there's any, we are not putting any embargo, so to say, on who should be the end users of decision-focused evaluations or demand-driven research. I think it really depends on the context. There are some topics that are maybe politically sensitive, and so policymakers will tend to stay away from them, for example, but then civil society might need that evidence to be able to advocate for policy to change in that particular space, in which case then the end users you would target in that particular context will be civil society. There are contexts where the community wants to take things into their own hands, and they need that evidence to help them either to push their policymakers into acting, or for them to even just make their own changes. I remember when I was working as a public health researcher, there's this work we used to publish on verbal autopsies, for example. It's not a perfect example of evaluation, but nonetheless an example of how communities can use research. And through that process, we were often able to present to the community what the leading causes of death are, especially among children. And that's the kind of information that the community can now use and say, you know what, in this day and age, having children dying from diarrhea, from pneumonia, these are preventable things. And it really comes down to us being a bit more proactive in certain aspects, encouraging mothers to reach out when they need to community health workers, etc. So again, it really depends on the context. Back to you, Prof.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Elizabeth. I want to pose a question that has come from the audience, and the question is: we are here talking about demand-driven research initiative. Do African governments even embed research findings into practice or policy? And if they do they even commit in terms of budgets? You've worked in both Uganda and Malawi, so
I think one of the biggest challenges is that we haven't nurtured the relationship with policymakers. And I say we, I mean researchers. We do our research and then think it's going to be appropriate and relevant for policy without actually understanding what policymakers think is relevant. And so importantly, we need to start nurturing those relationships, because policymakers have funding or budget line items for implementation. So our work needs to speak to what it is that they're implementing. What we know for sure is that the R&D budget for the African continent remains quite low, and African research is still heavily reliant on non-African external funding. And I think importantly, I'm really glad to see that Chris is here and that he's part of this conversation, because it's important. He says that, the funders should be sort of at a higher level overseeing everything that's going on and allowing researchers to look at research that's relevant. But I think they need to be part of the conversation, because we can't assume that all funders' intentions are altruistic. I think it's important to make sure that we all sit around the table and that everyone's interests are at least considered, if not accommodated. And I will say one more thing. I think, yes, demand-driven research is critically important, but there is value in independent research as well, and we need to appreciate that as we take this conversation forward. I am a complete advocate for ensuring that African research capacity is leveraged to drive an African-led agenda and to drive development on the continent. But I also recognize that our agendas cannot be completely comprehensive and might overlook critical aspects. So Blue Skies research is essential to ensure that we don't stifle innovation. And it's important for me that we strike that balance.
Thank you. We have very interesting observations from the audience. Someone is saying that research should be specified when talking about its potential impact. Fundamental versus applied, both are important. And I think we seem to agree from what is being said here. That also research is a social activity that should be embedded in the larger society. And if that is the understanding of the demand-driven research, then this should be evident. And I want to agree in entirety that that's the understanding of demand-driven research. Dr. Robin Miller, there is a thank you comment for you that's saying that you are on spot on limited training in evaluation, especially in most of higher education institutions in Africa, and it's a clear gap. Okay, so your point is on spot. Those of us in these organizations need to respond to this by creating the demand. Demand-driven research initiatives and filling the gap through appropriate capacities that's more experiential, like what Dr. Elizabeth is doing. Another comment on are evidence-based researches understood by beneficiaries and what methods are used to attract extension officers in evidence-based researchers. I don't know if some of you can take that in just 1 minute. So it's much related to what you answered, but you can take it in a minute because we need to close in 4 minutes.
Sorry, just repeat that.
It's a question on chat there on the Q&A. Are evidence-based researches understood by beneficiaries? And I was saying you kind of answered that.
So that, yeah, I mean that the onus now is on the researchers to make sure that the end users understand the research, and that's why it's part of our strategy. We have an explicit strategy on raising awareness about the value of decision-focused evaluations of demand-driven research, and of communicating that to the end users in a manner that they understand. And in fact, NIERA has developed curriculum for various key constituencies. So it includes even the media, so that they can understand what decision-focused evaluations are all about. So media, policymakers, we developed different curricula targeting these different constituencies.
Thank you. A quick comment from Antoinette, who agrees 100% with Chris and says that research results take long to reach those who need them most. And so piecemeal dissemination can help. And Chris, many people tend to agree with you that universities need to realign their focus towards evidence-based research that serves humanity. So I think that's what we had time for as of now. We still have 2-3 minutes, so we can have Professor Richard Mukadawire to give us his closing remarks as we wind up this activity for today and give us the way forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Njuguna. I think this has been a very exciting subject, very exciting, and there's no doubt at all from our minds, I mean, particularly some of us who have worked with continental organizations, that this is actually a subject of enormous importance in defining or in supporting African-defined development processes. I think there is urgency in moving towards advancing this particular subject on demand-driven research, and I think building a community of a practice, that is actually robust. It's African-anchored, but again supported by our colleagues from the global north that are committed to driving this type of research. So from the Alliance for African Partnership, therefore, we do not see this as a one-shot activity, but rather we see it as a launchpad for strengthening the platform which Professor Oti is leading, and in ensuring that we have, use that as an entry point for building a coalition of the willing that are committed to undertaking this kind of research. Would like to follow up on that. We're also, I think, keen in documenting some of the work you have undertaken as researchers over many years, to see how best your work might influence a new research approach. We might therefore wish to consider, and we'll be discussing further with our colleagues gathered here, to consider publication of some of your work that indeed can influence a new research direction. I think also we'll be very keen that we reflect very deeply on how we begin to develop a critical mass of young researchers, but also not ignoring all the researchers like myself in retooling ourselves on how we might actually proceed towards undertaking this kind of research. So training, I think is extremely important. I'm delighted that you brought on board, Chris, representing some of the funders, and I trust that Chris and others are listening and they'll respond to our request when we pitch a call for deepening this dialogue, more particularly with not just among ourselves, but also this time around perhaps with some of our decision makers, particularly in Africa. And I think that would be an important area to take forward as well, in strengthening that dialogue with the decision makers, so that they realize that we're not all ivory tower researchers, but they are individuals that are committed to undertaking impactful research in support of transforming lives, in support of strengthening the Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, extremely important. And therefore, I look forward to our further engagement with our partners and to everybody else. And allow me, therefore, I think to thank Dr. Oti for his keynote address. And also I'd like to thank the panelists. But last but not least, I would like to thank our moderator, Professor Njuguna, for stimulating and facilitating this stimulating dialogue. As AAP, we will definitely follow up with you to ensure that this dialogue emerges as a new beginning of a new research movement through strengthening a platform on demand-driven research. We look forward to engaging you further on this extremely important subject. And I'd like to thank all participants, and we look forward to hearing from you on how you see us shaping a continental movement on demand-driven research. Much appreciated for your attention and your participation. We look forward to interacting some more going into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. So I think we can accept that, and we continue engaging in the community of practice.